Hello. As a child, I was often told, "You're so smart, you just need to apply yourself more." Or, my favorite, "Just pay attention and stop being lazy." As an adult, I have heard, "You have so much more potential," more times than I'd like to admit. It wasn't until my diagnosis of ADHD as an adult that I could finally understand my struggles as a child. The amount of negative stigma, shame, and misunderstanding that surrounds ADHD is shocking, considering it's one of the most researched psychological disorders there is out there. ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, and it impacts around 11% of children and almost 5% of adults in the U.S. ADHD is a mental health condition that can cause unusual levels of hyperactivity and impulse behaviors. This can impact the parts of the brain that help us plan, focus on, and execute tasks. This makes it often more difficult to diagnose in girls and adults. ADHD is a highly controversial and is debated on many topics that involve different aspects of ADHD. And one topic that I would like to debate further is that ADHD is just a childhood disorder. I believe that ADHD affects both children and adults. My first argument is that an ADHD diagnosis doesn't just go away when entering adulthood, and it can exhibit itself in many different ways. My second argument is that oftentimes, if not diagnosed correctly, ADHD symptoms can be ignored as a child. Adults are often just undiagnosed or continue to be misdiagnosed. My first point is that an ADHD diagnosis can change over time, but it's rarely outgrown. ADHD children that exhibit different symptoms compared to adults, such as trouble sitting still, interrupting, waiting their turn, and often throw tantrums. According to a study that measured the long-term outcomes of individuals living with ADHD, it was shown that people with ADHD had poorer long-term outcomes in the following: social behaviors and functions, academics, driving, drug use, addictive behavior, obesity, and also within their occupation. There are ways that ADHD can be seen in an adult, and it's easy to see how many people think that ADHD is just a childhood disorder based on this misunderstanding that surround the symptoms and behaviors in childhood ADHD versus adult ADHD. Another way that I believe that an ADHD diagnosis changes over time but rarely is outgrown is how an ADHD diagnosis that is given to a child at a young age can lead to an adult that, combined with treatment, they're giving coping skills that are being practiced and developed in a crucial part of a child's learning years, which have great outcomes in adult, making them not exhibit signs often associated with ADHD. And this, I feel, is what makes people believe that it only affects children. Dr. Tanya Frolich, a developmental behavioral pediatrician at Cincinnati Children's Hospital and a professor at the UC, the Department of Pediatrics, said, "Having an ADHD diagnosis is not just having symptoms, it's actually being impaired. When a combination of behavioral interventions, counseling, and medication are used to treat symptoms, this allows for more success in life. Overall, it gives the necessary tools and knowledge for an adult managing their ADHD well, to the point that symptoms aren't even seen, but the disorder is still there and never disappears." My second point is that many adults, if not given their diagnosis as a child, continue to be misdiagnosed as an adult. Like myself, particularly many other women, it's often misdiagnosed as other disorders such as anxiety, mood disorders, and depression due to all the similarities and the overlapping of symptoms. A symptom such as hyperactivity can turn inward, such as racing thoughts, and this tends to be treated as anxiety when it's actually in fact overactivity in the brain caused by ADHD. Another point I have on this argument is that despite all the research on ADHD, there are some physicians that just still don't believe ADHD exists, especially in adults, and the lack of training in recognizing these adult ADHD symptoms is real. According to 93% of adult psychiatrists, they were asked and they were reported that they have never had any type of training on ADHD, not in their residency or within their continuing education. This is a stereotype that often makes us think of ADHD as just a hyper little boy, and it gives the impression that only children can have ADHD, leading many adults to struggle their entire lives. In conclusion, I feel like this negative stigma that surrounds an ADHD disorder and the diagnosis, I feel like this just tends to lead people to believe that why this is only a childhood disorder. I believe that ADHD is a disorder that affects both children and adults. I gave 2 arguments to support my stance. One in which that the ADHD diagnosis can change over time, but I don't feel like an adult ever outgrows it. I feel like they just learn to manage and adapt their symptoms based on treatment they might have had at a younger age and coping skills, even masking of skills. And my second point is that many adults, when not given an ADHD diagnosis as a child, continue to be misdiagnosed. And this just can be very dangerous, and, it's not helpful for an adult to continue to be misdiagnosed when the research is there that it just doesn't go away when they become an adult. So thank you for listening today, and I hope I have gave you knowledge on why I feel ADHD is an adult disorder just as much as it is a childhood disorder. Thank you.